Hey, this is Shelby Allen, and this is for CS6750, I think, HCI, and I'm just doing a verbal description, kind of a conversation actually, with my girlfriend.
Oh my god, you gotta restart
No,
that.
no, no.
Oh my
No, we're
god.
keeping it going. We're doing it live.
It's like the worst
We're doing
podcast
it
ever.
live. I know, right? So, doing a verbal description of one of my interface ideas for remedial math slash math anxiety, trying to overcome those things. And so, one of my ideas, and I am Shelby, and this is Brittany, and the idea that we're going to talk about is a book to try and help alleviate those problems. So, I'll give descriptions, and then I've just sort of offered for her to chime in and give questions, and I'll also try and prompt a few questions as well in regards to my selection criteria for prototypes. So first off, the description itself. Growing up, I really enjoyed these old school choose your own adventure books like Car Wars and other obviously crappily written stuff. But one of their key components was that you would read the story for a while. You also kind of had your own character sheet, and then at a certain part of the story, it would ask you to check your character sheet, and if you had this piece of equipment, then you could turn to this page, but if you didn't, you have to turn to a different page. And then some of them had mechanics for like combat or rolling dice, and the outcomes of how you interacted with your character sheet dictated where you went in the book. So with all of that extensive description out of the way, one of the ways that I believe centrally to help alleviate math anxiety, I guess I should mention my criteria right now, are um, I imagine that the solution needs to be private and that it should be companion-like and friendly. It should be able to kind of fit into a busy day, something convenient, and something that helps kind of engage continuous user interaction. Because I mean, at the heart of it, math requires practice, and so that part can't be overstated. So anyway, I imagine a situation. One of the problems with people getting back into math, as a result of some of my previous surveys, is that people don't really know what they don't know. And so I thought that one of the things that the solution to this task would need is to help users identify which math principles they should be studying, rather than having them start at the very beginning or then having them decide for themselves and becoming overwhelmed. I've been trying to imagine an organic process that helps them find that. And so I thought about Choose Your Own Adventure books. So, idea, prototype, uh, is a book that at the beginning of the book there's some sort of math problem, some sort of character sheet that you kind of fill out as to what you think you know about math. Something that begins to paint a picture for what you know and what you don't know. And then as you navigate through the book, then it will test you or ask you certain math questions. Not so much as testing you knowing the intricacies of all these rules, but more general principles at first. And then, depending on your responses, it'll navigate you to different parts of the book. And it'll occasionally also take in conditional information of what you've written onto your character sheet. And then, ideally, by the end of navigating through this book and answering a number of questions, the book could say, okay, well, according to your character sheet, this is what you should be studying. And, it would be something like, hey, you know everything up to, but you don't know anything about algebra. Or it's like you don't know mixed fractions. Or it's like, okay, well you're up to calculus, but you're really bad at trig, and those trigonometric identities are keeping you from furthering your skills in calculus. So I think that at least for a book of this kind, the purpose is not so much the practicing, but sort of identifying what you would need to practice. So that's the idea in a nutshell. And so, first off, I guess just general thoughts. Brittany, what do you think about? Now, you're a self-diagnosed math anxiety,
Phobic,
a
yeah.
math phobic person. What are your thoughts, just in general, about this sort of thing? I know it's well, I'm not going to color your expectations. What do you think?
Better not. I like the idea of it being story and character driven, kind of like lulling you into the activities or giving the activities a sense of purpose or place. place. Like, if you're trying to diagnose where you are, I could see like really beautiful illustrations of like different parts of different landscapes that are, no better or worse than the other, so that you don't feel like you're,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in a bad place. You're just in a different place, or you're trying to diagnose where you are, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the idea of like tying it to visuals and characters and a story. When you say starting out with some kind of test that gives me anxiety, I would need a little bit more of like a narrative context before I could start filling in math problems.
That's a good point. It's funny that you mentioned those particular pieces because as when I'm imagining translating the concept of a choose your own adventure book to this, really the only piece my initial thought was to take over was just the like conditional page turning to like if you got this problem go here, if you didn't get this problem go there. But you're right that taking it a step further and sort of designing a narrative around it
Mm-hmm.
in illustrations, which if I remember correctly, I mean, of course, all of those books had stories, but some of them had illustrations as well. And since you were playing a role as a character, there's a little bit of maybe there's a little bit of comfort in that disassociation here,
Mm-hmm.
where if you're, there's a little bit
You're
of
playing
abstract.
something out, yeah.
Exactly, you're playing a role, and that role is yes, it will represent you in some ways, but since it's this other character, you can be a little bit more
Yeah,
playful, a
there's a
little
little distance.
yeah, yeah. So that's an interesting point. Um,
It's making me think of the video game we played.
oh, Oxenfree.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
really good point. Yeah, and that was so it was so great, and that's in the sense that it was the moving around was not really it was technically part of a story, but or how you played the game, but the real part of playing the game was the making the conversation choices
Mm-hmm.
as they came and
Mm-hmm.
went, and that had effects for subsequent conversations. And so maybe there's a certain something very unique to that story is that you could just choose not to make a response at certain times, and
Mm-hmm.
so something that has been mulling through my head about this remedial math stuff is all of the situations in which people feel overwhelmed. I remember sometimes looking at all three answers in Oxenfree and saying, you know what, I don't like any of these.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to let it ride out and see what
And
happens.
the story just kept flowing. It wasn't,
Exactly. It
there's no.
wasn't huge stress. It's like you didn't have to make a choice if none of them felt like that for you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly off the top of my head
There
how
were
that would.
also like challenges with the ghosts, like times where it
Mm-hmm.
was time imperative. It was kind of like a test
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
affected the game.
Yeah, and so I guess there's kind of that juxtaposition there where there were situations along the path where if you didn't know exactly what the answer was, or if you felt like there were certain situations that were very like answer agnostic
Mm-hmm.
as to whether or not you gave an answer. And maybe that's something to help people with math anxiety is that every time they look at a math problem, they feel like it's a test. So maybe part of this interface is to help each math problem not feel like a test, but just another part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of what we
The
talked about.
story.
Yeah, yeah, kind of the story aspect or the companionship aspect. And
The
then you're right that there's the other parts that have the challenge. And hopefully by the time hopefully there's enough difference between those two sections that the challenge is almost in a sense like whether or not you win or lose the challenge, you know that it's really a challenge and everything else is just more supportive.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it like confirms your skill set.
Right, right.
Yeah, for some reason when you were first describing it, the visuals that keep coming to me are like different landscapes. So there's different like types of math and concepts, and like you can kind of journey to different
Mm-hmm.
landscapes. You're not a better or worse person for not being in one landscape over another,
Right.
but maybe it's motivating to want to say, maybe just having really beautiful art is motivating to be like, well, I want to like see what's in the Arctic,
Yeah.
like
No,
explore that region for a little bit, see how I feel about it.
that's a good point. Like making sure that every area is, I guess, it's sort of a pleasure to be in because there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people that, I guess, in a sense, are embarrassed about if someone were to think about where they would have to practice math, like um, and even for myself, like I think relatively speaking, I'm pretty good at math, but I haven't studied math in a long time, and so were I to try and get back into math, it would be several subjects behind where I have been in the past, and in
Mm-hmm.
a sense, that's kind of embarrassing. Like, um, I studied three-dimensional calculus, but I would probably have to go as far back as like linear algebra before I did anything else. And then other people like, um, I've known people that I brought up mixed fractions before because I know seriously that there are some adults that in cooking or whatever, they're just like when
Yeah,
there's a mixed
I have a
fraction, it's
hard
like
time
I
too.
exactly, and
Yeah.
so being able to make people
Mm.
feel welcome in every environment is a
And
cool idea.
creating like real life situations for math
Mm.
when it's applicable.
Right, that's a good point. That's something that in the reviewing of these different um, ideas for this task comes up in. There was sort of like all of the different curriculum for younger students. There's certain pieces that it's like, okay, well, this is related to math, but this is also something that I imagine most adults do just fine. Like some of it's like dealing with money. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's one where it's like, well, if this adult is adulting every day, they probably know how to handle change. You know, they probably
Well,
know how to
yeah.
handle dollars, and so some with
But
the
like
goal of
figuring
this,
out interest or like,
right,
tracking their
right,
stocks or I don't know.
yeah, that's definitely a level that is sufficiently advanced that it is something that comes up definitely in adult life, and there's
Mm-hmm.
no guarantee that someone has all the skills they need to execute on
Mm-hmm.
that. That's a good point. Good points. So, before we get too far along, I want to ask you the questions about our selection criteria.
Okay.
So, we may have covered them some, but I'll go from left to right. I'm looking at our beautiful post-it note wall. On the left, what are your thoughts about this in terms of being a private solution to this task? About how private does this feel to you? Are there other ways that it could be more private?
If it's something I'm opting in, for some reason, as you're describing it, I'm thinking of it as either a book or a video game because it seems so well suited for like a video game as well, like
Mm-hmm.
what you're talking about. Um, so, but in both of those contexts, I'm opting into using them. The only thing I'll say is that with books, sometimes if you take a book out in public, it's a real shame when it's a book that has a really shitty cover that embarrasses you, even if it's a good content. So it
Right,
would have to
right,
be it shouldn't have this like big red like math for dummies, like I'm an idiot at math or whatever.
right,
Something
right.
and something that looks, adult or just
Mm-hmm.
not embarrassing design.
Like someone reading Mating in Captivity on
Yeah.
Marta.
Oh, that book has such a bad cover, and
Oh,
it's such a good book.
yeah, it's such a exactly
So that's what I would say as far as privacy goes. I don't want it to draw too much attention, but if someone were to
tasteful.
see it,
Yeah,
tasteful,
no,
nice look.
that's a really interesting consideration. Just even the outside of it can help it be
Yeah,
a little bit more private.
yeah.
Good feedback. Let's see. Next one. Feelings of companionship, feelings of friendliness. Part of math anxiety is tied to math performance, but a lot of it is, also just psychological. And so one
Mm-hmm.
of the selection criteria I chose was just wanting to make sure that um, whatever interface was chosen in such that it didn't feel, it wasn't giving negative feedback. It wasn't doing any of those things. So, how do you feel about this interface in terms of that criterion?
I think that's what I'm speaking to when I talk about really beautiful art that kind of abstracts the math itself and narrative um, things that
Those are
are
just
almost
aesthetically
from
pleasing.
different contexts that kind of um, make the math more palatable and
Right.
less scary,
Well, it's like, why can't,
less in your face.
right, why can't the book be beautiful?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also when I'm thinking of, and this is just like for whatever reason what's stuck in my head, but when I'm thinking of I'm thinking of things that are neutral and pleasing, like landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
will make different levels of math seem friendlier to me because they're associated with something something
Also, something that has a positive positive emotional response.
Yeah, and something different from like scary words like statistics or
So,
calculus.
so like if there's word
Things I
problems
have
in there,
associations
it
with.
should be something like puppies. You know, like so you're choosing
You
to
have
adopt
5 puppies.
Someone gives you 5 more puppies. How
You know,
quantify how happy you are.
I actually heard something really interesting about that. Actually, um, Marissa Peer talks about how in some of the more successful private schools, they do math word problems that are like you that give you a visual of yourself, which are you own a business, you're
Hmm.
negotiating, blah blah blah. She's like, when I was in school, so her brothers were sent to private school, and she went to remedial school because her parents thought she was dumb.
Oh man.
And so, but her point being, like, the word problems were set up in this area of success. Like, you're a successful businessman, you're making these decisions. This is how the word problems were
Yeah.
framing this context. And hers were like, you have 2 apples, someone stole both your apples. Like, but I mean, her point being, like, you know, the
if you're gonna
word
visualize
problems create visuals in your head, yeah, and so like
There's
you can make them empowering or disempowering.
Yeah, that's a fascinating
point. It was
it's
really
like
interesting.
if you're going to imagine yourself in a scenario, then why not use it as an opportunity for
Successful,
empowerment
yeah.
instead of like gang violence has destroyed the closest store
or like you
and said
had
you
food,
need to
now
choose.
you have no food.
Yeah, now you have no food. Oh, that's a great point.
Okay,
oh my god.
So yeah,
okay.
Empowering context.
Empowering context. I love
or
that.
at least neutral or positive association context.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Third of fourth criteria. Third one is fit into a busy day, convenience. You know, people see math as an insurmountable task, and just it. And the truth is, there's no way getting around how much practice it takes to be good at math. And so, to make anything successful within this task space, the person's going to need to a certain amount of convenience needs to be had, because the more we ask out of someone's day to participate in our interface, just by sheer opportunity cost, it's going to have more and more competition.
Mm-hmm.
So for this interface, this book, how do you feel about that?
I think that's probably the biggest hindrance for a book, because even someone who quote unquote likes to read books, it is difficult. There is a barrier in our modern life to going and getting a book because you assume sitting and reading will take too much concentrated time that you assume you don't have, which is not true, but it's just less stimulating than our devices that are always around.
That's true. And I would agree that the perception's there, because I think we are both self-proclaimed book lovers.
But I have a hard time going and picking up
Yeah.
a book and reading for an hour at a time.
Yeah.
You know.
That's true. And when I do sit down to read, I do like reading for a long time. I don't think I necessarily have to read for a long time to enjoy it. I could probably read for 10, 15 minutes and enjoy it.
That's what I've been trying to practice.
Yeah, but I will admit that it's not something that I choose to do, because there is a part of me that is sort of like, when I imagine reading, I imagine like when I was a kid on Sundays after church, everybody kind of goes to their own bed and sits down and reads for 3 or 4 hours, and then at some point, like, dinner's ready or something. Like,
yeah, I think I avoid it, because I think, like, well, if I don't have enough time to read half this book, then it's not worth it right now. And so I assume that like 15 minutes of a 400-page book isn't worth it. Right. I think is the barrier to entry. So anyway, I would say, number 1, make the book easy to spend 15 minutes with. And number 2, maybe make it, have you ever seen those Wreck the Journal books? Make it interactive and tactile, where you can do like an activity, like write on the page and stuff. Activities.
Yeah.
And that would also lend itself to small chunks of time, I think.
Good points.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. Keep the users coming back. I think this one's also tied to convenience.
Interactive.
It's interactive. Obviously, if this is going to provide benefit to the user, then they have to use it a lot. They have to get all the way through. I guess in terms of this interface, they have to get all the way through to kind of learn what they should be working on. So we need to... What do you think about how well this does that in terms of encouraging the user to continue?
I think a narrative where there's some kind of story progress that you're going to want to get to the end will help. Where there's like a thread, there's a reason to finish.
Solid.
There's payoffs.
Yeah. Seeing how the story ends.
Yeah.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's over 20 minutes. I think we did a good job. Did we do a
Boom.
good job?
I think so.
Excellent. Good job, us. Bye-bye.